If anyone had any lingering doubts about the role of slavery in causing the Southern states to secede from the Union in 1861, Vice President Alexander Stephens' speech, explaining the difference between the constitutions of the U.S. and the Confederate States of America, should have abolished those doubts. As he said, the cornerstone of the new government was the assertion that slavery was the natural condition of African Americans. In doing so, they called the Founding Fathers fundamentally wrong. But of course, in 1861, no one had any doubt as to the reason why Southern states left the Union. Forces on both sides of the issue had been gathering for decades. In just over half a century, the tiny abolitionist societies begun by Quakers in New England had grown into formidable organizations. Their leaders insisted that slavery was not simply a social evil, but an issue of personal morality. That each individual slaveholder was personally, morally culpable. Slave narratives and novels such as Uncle Tom's Cabin raised awareness and anger among the public, particularly in the North. Southern planters were affronted by this approach. Believing themselves to be morally upright, they rejected accusations that they were sinful simply for owning slaves. Southern leaders changed from apologizing for slavery as a necessary evil to proclaiming it as a positive good. They insisted that persons living in Africa were in much worse living conditions than the descendants of those who had been brought over as slaves. As humanity does so often, they did not look to morality and then determine the proper way to live, but instead looked at how they were living and determined that to be the proper morality. The dividing line between North and South grew even sharper, and it was drawn on the issue of slavery. As the U.S. gained more and more territory, expanding westward according to its manifest destiny, disagreements became arguments. Arguments became fights. Fights became battles, and eventually, battles became war, as America dragged itself up from slavery.
Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
The invention of the cotton gin and the resultant growth of the cotton industry meant an explosion in the slave population. In Georgia, the number of slaves in the population rose from less than 30,000 in 1790 to over 460,000 in 1860. Looking at the major slave-holding states of 1790, Virginia, South Carolina, Maryland, North Carolina, Georgia, and Delaware, their combined slave population grew 177% between 1790 and 1860, from about 640,000 to almost 1.8 million. But for slave power to really grow, it would have to expand beyond the states where it had always been legal. It would need to expand westward, into the territories acquired by the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican-American War. By 1860, the major slave states created from these territories, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas, would have over 2.1 million slaves. Small wonder, then, that the abolitionists fought so hard to keep slavery out of those territories, and Southern planters fought so hard to expand slavery into them. The U.S. Congress, while still operating under the Articles of Confederation, made its first attempt to limit the spread of slavery into new territories in 1787. The Northwest Ordinance established the process whereby territories would be governed by the U.S. and could eventually become states. The U.S. had acquired a vast western territory from Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris. The Northwest Ordinance described that part of the territory northwest of the Ohio River and declared that slavery would be prohibited in those lands. The prohibition on slavery did not apply to the territory south of the Ohio, continuing America's sectarian divide in labor, ideology, and economy. However, those lands were currently claimed by Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, and were thus already slave states. Eventually, those states would relinquish their claims, and the southern lands would be carved into the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. When the Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the territory of the U.S., a New Deal became necessary. The Northwest Ordinance did not address these new lands, and therefore there was no limitation on slavery there. The Missouri Compromise in 1820 set new boundaries following the principles of the Northwest Ordinance. The deal came about because the people of the area that would become Missouri wished to join the Union as a slave state. This would have given slave states an advantage of one state in the Senate, and therefore many Northerners were opposed. The compromise that resulted allowed the admission of Missouri as a slave state simultaneously with the admission of Maine as a free state. The compromise also prohibited slavery in the remaining territory north of Missouri's southern border, except within Missouri itself. Thomas Jefferson was greatly disturbed by the Missouri Compromise.
I had for a long time ceased to read the newspapers or pay any attention to public affairs, confident they were in good hands, and content to be a passenger in our bark to the shore from which I am not distant. But this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the keel of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. I regret that I am now to die in the belief that this useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 76 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their sons, and that my only consolation is to be that I live not to weep over it.
Jefferson feared that clearly establishing a portion of the country as free and a portion slave would inevitably lead to the Union being ripped apart. He favored a gradual process of emancipation and expatriation, whereby freed slaves could be colonized elsewhere. Many free blacks and former slaves opposed this idea, demanding that this was their country as much as it was those who had descended from Europeans. Regardless, Jefferson's predicted crisis of disunion was fast approaching, and the issue of dividing territories would become one of the greatest flashpoints. In 1837, the policy of the Missouri Compromise continued, with Arkansas being admitted to the Union as a slave state, while Michigan was admitted as a free state. In 1850, difficulties broke out again. The slave state of Texas, which had been annexed in 1845, claimed land north of the Compromise's dividing line. This land had been ceded by Mexico in the Mexican-American War. Other issues also had the two sides talking secession. Anti-slavery activists were angered that the District of Columbia allowed slavery and contained the largest slave market in North America. At the same time, California had recently petitioned to join the Union as a free state, though its borders would cross below the Missouri Compromise line. These issues were wrapped up in the Compromise of 1850, which broke off part of Texas to form the New Mexico Territory, reimbursed Texas $10 million to pay off their war debt, abolished the trade, but not the practice of slavery in D.C., admitted California as a free state, and passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Everyone found something to hate about the compromise, but it succeeded in staving off a civil war for another 10 years. But it could not hold off bloodshed entirely. It was only 4 years before another conflict over territories led to open battle, guerrilla combat, and massacres and atrocities by both sides. Introduced by Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 changed the rules for determining whether a territory would be slave or free. Under the concept known as popular sovereignty, the residents of each territory would get to vote to decide whether slavery would be permitted. That is, the white, male residents would get to vote on whether peoples other than themselves could be enslaved. The act specifically repealed that part of the Missouri Compromise that outlawed slavery north of the line drawn in 1820. Douglas hoped this would win him the support of Southerners, his eye on an eventual bid for the presidency. But he did not consider the degree of opposition the bill would face in the North. In particular, he had no inkling of the future of one man in particular who would be energized by this act: Abraham Lincoln.
I was losing interest in politics when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused me again.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act was the impetus for the first round of the Lincoln-Douglas debates that launched Lincoln's national political career and carved out his views on slavery.
I think, and shall try to show, that it is wrong. Wrong in its direct effect, letting slavery into Kansas and Nebraska, and wrong in its prospective principle, allowing it to spread to every other part of the wide world where men can be found inclined to take it. This declared indifference for the spread of slavery I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest.
Despite the opposition of Lincoln and many others, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, signed into law on May 30th, 1854. The question of slavery in each territory would be determined by the vote of the people living there. And so the stage was set for the most strident, short-tempered, zealous, and potentially violent proponents of both slavery and abolition to marshal their forces and run to Kansas to swell the ranks of voters for their side in hopes of winning the state. Pro-slavery settlers moved in from Missouri, with some showing up just long enough to vote. Meanwhile, abolitionist societies back east were funding settlers to add their anti-slavery votes. Thousands of pro- and anti-slavery men and families moving to Kansas, planning to wage war at the ballot box, but also armed for a more physical confrontation. In the initial elections of November 1854, pro-slavery forces won out. Voter fraud was rampant. With only 1,500 registered voters, over 6,000 votes were cast. Tensions rose, and political chicanery became open violence. As violence broke out in Kansas, it also broke out on the Senate floor in D.C. Charles Sumner, an outspoken member of the Free Soil Party, which he had helped to form, gave a blistering speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act and against one of its proponents, Senator Butler from South Carolina.
The senator from South Carolina has chosen a mistress to whom he has made his vows, and who, though ugly to others, is always lovely to him. Though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. If the slave states cannot enjoy the full power in the national territories to compel fellowmen to be unpaid toil, to separate husband and wife, and to sell little children at the auction block, then, sir, the chivalric senator will conduct the state of South Carolina out of the Union. Has he read the history of the state which he represents? He cannot surely have forgotten its shameful imbecility from slavery, confessed throughout the Revolution, followed by its more shameful assumptions for slavery since. He cannot have forgotten its wretched persistence in the slave trade as the condition of its participation in the Union. Were the whole history of the South Carolina blotted out of existence from its very beginning down to the day of the last election of the senator to his present seat on this floor, civilization might lose less than it has already gained by the example of Kansas in its vigilant struggle against oppression.
Not surprisingly, Sumner's speech angered members from South Carolina. One of these, Representative Preston Brooks, was also a relative of Senator Butler. Brooks decided to attack Sumner in a manner that was much like the infamous whippings many slaveholders gave their slaves. On May 22, 1856, the very day after the sacking of Lawrence, Kansas, Brooks made his move. Sumner was seated at his writing desk in the Senate chamber when Brooks appeared, flanked by Kite and Congressman Henry Edmondson of Virginia. Before Sumner could rise from his chair, Brooks clubbed him over the head with his cane. Several senators rushed to Sumner's aid, but Kite drew a pistol and shouted, "Let them be." It would be 3 years before Sumner returned to serve in the Senate, suffering physically and emotionally from the beating. Brooks resigned his seat after surviving a vote to expel him from the House. He stood again for election, and his district returned him to Congress. The assault on the Senate floor raised tempers even further in both North and South. Southern reaction did little to gainsay Bryant's accusation. The Richmond Enquirer proclaimed,
We consider the act good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequence. These vulgar abolitionists in the Senate are getting above themselves. The truth is, they have been suffered to run too without their collars. They must be lashed into submission.
The most significant violent reaction to the sacking of Lawrence and the assault on Senator Sumner was led by a man who would gain greater infamy for another raid just a few years later. John Brown was a sheep farmer who had been dedicated to abolition for years, serving as a conductor in the Underground Railroad. When some of his large brood of sons moved with their families to Kansas in 1855, he learned from them of the attacks by pro-slavery forces. He left New York to join them, gathering weapons along the way. Brown was angered by the violence used by pro-slavery forces and the meekness of the Free State settlers. He joined a Free State military group along with some of his sons, and in the wake of the attacks on Lawrence and Sumner, he planned a violent retribution. Less than a year after these incidents in Kansas, the issue of Congress setting aside territories as being slave or free rose again. The U.S. Supreme Court declared that Congress did not have and never did have the authority to outlaw slavery in any part of the United States. The case was Dred Scott v. Sanford, in which the court further declared that persons of African descent, slave or free, were not citizens of the United States. Dred Scott was brought to Missouri by his owner, Peter Blow, around 1830. Scott's ownership passed to Army Surgeon John Emerson, who in 1833 moved with Scott to Fort Armstrong, Illinois. Emerson, with Scott, stayed in the Free State of Illinois for about 3 years. They also lived for a time at Fort Snelling in the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was prohibited under the Missouri Compromise. Scott eventually married a slave owned by someone else, but his wife, Harriet, was either purchased or given to Emerson so that the couple could be together. After Emerson died, Scott tried and failed to purchase freedom for himself and his family from Emerson's widow. With the help of abolitionists, Scott sued for his own freedom in 1846. His case was based on the grounds that by becoming a resident in a territory that prohibited slavery, he was, in fact, emancipated. The case wound its way through courts over the years, finally landing in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1856. The Supreme Court of the United States, whose members included 5 slaveholders, had declared that the Congress had never had the authority to issue the Northwest Ordinance nor the Missouri Compromise prohibiting slavery in any part of the United States. Furthermore, the court declared that Dred Scott and all persons of African descent could not be citizens of the United States, even if they were recognized as citizens of an individual state. The immediate consequence of the decision was that Dred Scott and his family failed to secure their freedom in court. The sons of Scott's original owners, who as children had grown up with Dred Scott, purchased Scott and his family and set them free. But across the country, there was no such simple solution to the court's ruling. As Lincoln said in his House-divided speech in 1858,
Such a decision is all that slavery now lacks of being alike lawful in all the states. Such decision is probably coming and will soon be upon us unless the power of the present political dynasty shall be met and overthrown. We shall lie down pleasantly, dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free, and we shall awake to the reality instead that the Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state.
in that same speech, Lincoln foresaw the coming Civil War.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will address the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south.
John Brown would help divide the House further with his next and final militant effort against pro-slavery forces. Since the Pottawatomie Massacre, Brown had led smaller operations raiding into Missouri. Then he hit upon a new idea. He and his men would set up a base in the Blue Ridge Mountains, from which they could launch raids into slave plantations. But in 1859, he focused his attention at another target, the government armory and arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He planned to use those weapons to arm what he expected to be an army of fugitive slaves that would join him. But he failed to convince one important escaped slave. John Brown had long been a friend of Frederick Douglass. Douglass had preached pacifism prior to 1850, but in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Law, he believed that he who would be free must himself strike the first blow. Brown appealed to Douglass to join him in the raid. Douglass later spoke of it.
A few weeks prior to his meditated attack on Harper's Ferry, I was summoned by John Brown to meet him in an old deserted stone quarry in Chambersville, Pennsylvania. Until that night, I did not know what was John Brown's plan for conducting his campaign against slavery. We spent that night and the succeeding Sunday in conference on the question of whether the blow should be struck at Harper's Ferry or whether another plan we had talked over should be carried out. Captain Brown was for boldly striking Harper's Ferry at once and for capturing the arsenal and armory. I was for avoiding Harper's Ferry altogether. I told him finally that he was going into a steel trap from which there was no escape, and that I did not see it as my duty to follow him.
Douglas' prediction was correct. He later described Brown's assault on Harper's Ferry.
On the night of the 16th of October, 1859, there appeared a party of 19 men, 14 white and 5 black. They were not only armed themselves, but had brought with them a large supply of arms for such persons as might join them. 3 out of the 19 invaders were captured whilst fighting, and one of these was Captain John Brown.
John Brown died by hanging on December 2nd, 1859. Half his men were killed during the raid, including one of Brown's sons. Most of the others were captured and hanged. 4 men escaped, including another of Brown's sons. This was one more event to shock the consciences of the American people and to put them into opposing camps on the rightness of Brown's cause, if not his methods. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who tried to walk a line that would earn him support from both Southern and Northern voters in the next presidential election, described his perception of John Brown's actions as they reflected the opinions of the relatively new and anti-slavery Republican Party. In response, Lincoln replied in another speech.
Some of you admit that no Republican designedly aided or encouraged the Harper's Ferry affair, but still insist that our doctrines and declarations necessarily lead to such results. We do not believe it. Republican doctrines and declarations are accompanied with a continual protest against any interference whatever with your slaves or with you about your slaves.
Statesmen like Douglas and Lincoln debated each other, but blood had now been drawn too many times for words to heal. The raid on Harper's Ferry would be seen by many as the first shots fired in the Civil War. Decades later, Frederick Douglass would ask an audience about the success of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry.
But the question is, did John Brown fail? He certainly did fail to get out of Harper's Ferry before being beaten down by United States soldiers. He did fail to save his own life and to lead a liberating army into the mountains of Virginia. But he did not go to Harper's Ferry to save his life. The true question is, did John Brown draw his sword against slavery and thereby lose his life in vain? No man fails or can fail who so grandly gives himself and all he has to a righteous cause. Until this blow was struck, the prospect for freedom was dim, shadowy, and uncertain. The South staked all upon getting possession of the federal government, and failing to do that, drew the sword of rebellion and thus made her own, not John Brown's, the lost cause of the century.
In the election of 1860, the South made that bid for control of the federal government. All of the conflicts of the past decade came to a head in the presidential election. In the turmoil of the 1850s, the major American political parties were falling apart. The Whigs were essentially gone. Northern, anti-slavery Whigs joined the new Republican Party, which was entirely sectarian. The Republican Party's anti-slavery stance, which varied in degree among its members, meant that it had no place in the South. Most Southern Whigs joined the new Constitution Union Party. Meanwhile, the Democrats were torn across the Mason-Dixon line into Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. Abraham Lincoln, a former U.S. representative, was nominated by the Republicans. John Bell, former senator from Tennessee, received the Constitutional Party nomination. The Southern Democrats nominated the sitting vice president, John Breckinridge, and the Northern Democrats nominated Lincoln's old adversary, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Lincoln was, in the eyes of many Republicans, a moderate on the slave question. He was strongly opposed to its expansion into the territories, which he believed was in direct contrast with the intentions of the Founding Fathers. But he did not seek to eliminate slavery in those states where it was already permitted. Lincoln and Douglas battled in the North, while Bell and Breckinridge faced off in the South, though Douglas, unlike Lincoln, had some support in the South as well. Lincoln, as all know today, was the final winner of the election, but it was no sure thing. He was not even on the ballot in most of the slave states. Of almost 1,000 counties in the 15 slaveholding states in 1860, Lincoln won only 2. Nationally, he had only 40% of the popular vote, but that was considerably higher than his nearest opponent, Stephen Douglas, with 29%. Lincoln won 180 out of 303 Electoral College votes, making him the clear winner. To do that, he had to sweep the free states of the North. The Southern states were outraged. Not a single ballot had been cast for Abraham Lincoln in 10 Southern states because he was not on the ballot, and yet now he was president. South Carolina moved first, seceding from the Union on December 20th, 1860. They cited Lincoln's election as an overt act of aggression by the North. That is, they did not claim to be seceding because they had been attacked, or because the federal government was attempting to divest them of their slaves, but because the result of the presidential election was itself an offense. Within a few months, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had joined them. These states adopted a new constitution in February 1861 and declared themselves the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was appointed president by the delegates, and Alexander Stephens of Georgia was appointed vice president. The federal government did not immediately react to the secessions. Lincoln had not even taken office before they had written their new constitution. But soon came an action they could not ignore. Jefferson Davis ordered Confederate forces to capture Fort Sumter, which sat in Charleston Harbor. The attack, which began on April 12th, ended on April 14th, 1861, when the badly outnumbered Union force at Sumter surrendered. The war had begun. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas all seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. In the early stages of the war, relatively few Northerners saw their goal as freeing the slaves. The Northern armies fought to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But individuals took steps early on that moved the Union closer to emancipation. General Benjamin Butler in Virginia, May 1861, made the decision that he would not return fugitive slaves to their Southern masters. Those states, he argued, could not secede from the Union and then demand that their rights to human property, under the fugitive slave law, be protected by the federal government. Butler declared that these slaves were contraband of war and put them to work for the Union forces. He did not arm them, but every job completed by a contraband freed a white soldier to fight. And within a few months, he had almost 1,000 contrabands. Harriet Tubman, the famed conductor of the Underground Railroad, joined General Butler's forces to help organize and care for the contrabands. General John Fremont, Union commander in the West, declared martial law in the state of Missouri and announced that all slaves owned by Confederates in the state were now freed. Though abolitionists celebrated Fremont's move, Lincoln felt that it risked losing the support of the slave-owning border states, which had so far remained with the Union. He directed Fremont and other generals to only confiscate slaves performing services directly to the Confederacy. But many Northern soldiers had difficulty with that order and would declare that slaves that came to them had been providing services to the Confederacy when it might not have been strictly true. Slaves in the South at times had the experience of seeing Union armies marching past to do battle against armies that might include the slaves' masters or masters' sons. Jasper Battle of Georgia described a different experience.
During the big war, all the white folks was all for fighting, except them that was too old to fight or was too bad crippled and afflicted. They stayed home and looked after the women's and the children's. Somebody sent Mrs. word that them Yankees was on the way to our plantation. She done hid everything she could. Them had the hogs and horses drive off to the swamps and hid. Them Yankees was polite like, and they bothered nothing on our place, but they just plumb ruined everything on the plantation right close to ourn. They took nigh everything some of our neighbors had to eat, most all their good horses and everything else they wanted.
In the North, abolitionist pressure was building for a general emancipation of all slaves. Again, Lincoln feared what this would do to the support of the border states. On multiple occasions, he met with delegates from these states in an attempt to get them to accept some process of gradual emancipation, whereby the federal government would financially reimburse slave owners for their loss of property. But the offer was flatly refused. Congress was able to force the issue in the District of Columbia. In April 1862, about a year after the war began, Congress abolished slavery in the district and compensated former slave owners with payments of $300 per slave. It was the beginning of emancipation in America. Even in the North, there was resistance to the idea of large numbers of free blacks intermingling with whites. White workers feared the competition they might face, competing against workers whose experience was to labor without pay. Racist fears dovetailed with economic ones, as foes of emancipation warned of black men taking up with the daughters of white men. Anti-slavery forces resisted this backlash and stressed that emancipation would help the war effort. Lincoln, as ever, sought to preserve the Union. As he said,
My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that.
On September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued a proclamation that achieved that last option, freeing, in name, the overwhelming majority of slaves while leaving the others alone. The Emancipation Proclamation, taking advantage of the war powers granted to the Commander-in-Chief, declared that all slaves living in states that were in rebellion as of January 1st, 1863, would be free. Slaves living in the border states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were not included in Lincoln's proclamation, nor were those living in Confederate states, but within areas controlled by the Union. But this still meant that over 3 million slaves had been freed under the law by the stroke of a pen. Lincoln said at the time,
I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper.
but for now, these slaves were free in name only. It would take years of war and unimaginable carnage to make them free in fact. That carnage would be borne by the nation as a whole, and blacks would be part of it. The Emancipation Proclamation paved the way for the recruitment of black troops, so that, to paraphrase Frederick Douglass, those who would be free could strike their own blow. Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and other leaders in the black community would help recruit regiments of black troops who would prove that they could fight, bleed, and die as well as any white soldier. Death and destruction on a scale previously unknown to the country lay ahead. But the slaves of America were now reaching for the final rung on the ladder up from slavery.
Now see that possum, he works hard. Oh, hammer, oh. You turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, hammer, oh. But he can't work as hard as me. Oh, hammer, oh. He sits on a horse just as pretty as can be. Oh, hammer, oh.
He can ride on and leave me be.
Oh, hammer, oh. Oh, master, he be a hard man. Oh, hammer, oh. Sell my people away from me. Oh, hammer, oh. Lord, send my people into Egypt's land. Oh, hammer, oh. Lord, strike down Pharaoh and set them free. Oh, hammer, oh. Hammer, help me to pull these weeds. Oh, hammer, oh.
Am I you from the country?
Oh, hammer, oh. And I work as hard as two grown men. Oh, hammer, oh. Oh, Joseph was a woodworking man. Oh, hammer, oh. When he got old, he lost his way. Oh, hammer, oh. Makes a boss man right man. Oh, hammer, oh. Needs a young man to learn his trade. Oh, hammer, oh. You turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, hammer, oh. Rock my my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Oh, rocking my soul. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Oh, rocking my soul. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Oh, rocking my soul. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Oh, rocking my soul.